Welcome to video 3 in our series, Disaster Awareness. In this video, we are going to explore ways in which the churches can build on their strengths and their existing ministries, their gifts, to making meaningful contributions. In the face of disaster, large and small, churches and people feel drawn to help others. We, the church, understand that. This goes beyond the human reaction and has its roots in our membership of the body of Christ, the church in the world. The impulse to care for others sometimes can get sidetracked in the face of the feelings that we may have of ignorance or helplessness and confusion. By having some of the tools to understand the ways in which these gifts of the church may be made available to our communities, we find ways to help which are most effective and consistent with who we are.
Welcome back to our series on disaster awareness. In this session, we'll be talking about how to identify ways to contribute to the needs of those around us after a disaster. There is a conceptual model that's used by Episcopal Relief and Development, which is called an asset-based approach. The idea is to identify what our assets are, our gifts as a church, and how they can be brought to bear on the needs of the communities we're trying to help. It's a very human and compassionate response to want to help in a disaster or any traumatic event. When we stop to ask, how can we be helpful, it quickly becomes apparent that some discernment is required. What actions can we take as a church community which are helpful and meaningful to address the needs of the people we want so much to assist? This discernment process can be guided by thinking in these terms. First, we identify the gifts we have as a church, or perhaps a smaller group within the congregation. We'll talk about how to do this in a minute. The second step is to identify the needs of the people we want to help. Who are they? What do they need? And out of all that they may need, what is within our ability to help? Then the third step is to discern where these two things overlap. That's where our gifts can be used to help the people around us. We'll get to a few examples in a minute. But first, let's complicate things a bit. Remember this chart from video number 2. If you think about it even for a minute, it's clear that the needs of the people will change, maybe dramatically, over time. Consider that right after a disaster occurs, a big need may be for temporary shelter. Think cots in a gym. After a bit, some people may be able to return home. Others will need a place to live for months, maybe even permanently. All that means we have to keep in mind how the gifts we have match up with the needs of the people. Let's look for a minute at the idea of gifts. All churches have gifts, even though we may not see them clearly right at first. And gifts aren't just financial, although that's often the first thing we think of. A helpful way to think of them is the 5 P's, which are people, that is, members of your congregation and people connected to your ministries. Property, the church building, the parking lot, supplies, the rectory, and other facilities you might have. Purse, financial assets. Posture is your church community's culture, such as being outreach-oriented or having a commitment to seeking and serving Christ in all people. And finally, program, ministries and activities at your church. This includes everything from Bible study to homeless outreach ministries. Thinking about and identifying these 5 P's is the first step we talked about a minute ago. Next, let's talk about the needs and how to match up your gifts with those needs. After a disaster, there will be a whole host of needs, and no one can meet all of them. So what you do is look for something you can do, which is a response to the needs you've identified. What are some of the needs that people around you may have? How might you help? One way to start thinking about this is what you have to offer through your existing ministries. Let's look at some examples, and although they might seem small, they are all responding effectively to real needs. So, for example, several churches in the Gulf Coast area this past year responded to the hurricanes by making their facility available during the day to neighbors and other people in the community as a place of respite, to have coffee and cold drinks, to charge their cell phones, to charge other things, and that's a form of help that might only last a day or two or a week. A church with an existing meals ministry might expand that program by serving more meals or staying open for a longer time. Think about a time a little further along in the recovery process. A church with a program of gathering and distributing used clothing might expand its efforts or lend its people resources to other organizations which specialize in such services. One church realized that insurance and most assistance doesn't cover medical devices, including dentures, CPAP machines, prosthetic limbs, and things like that. They developed a program to assist people who'd lost things, and that helped them walk, to breathe, and eat. Further along in the recovery process, a church with a ministry supporting Habitat for Humanity, as an example, might choose to expand its efforts once the region's program of rebuilding is underway. Let's also think quickly about how good intentions can go wrong. There's famous stories in the disaster community where the gifts you may have to offer don't really fit the needs of those you're trying to meet. For example, there have been times when well-meaning groups of people have gathered up a lot of clothing and shipped it to an area that is just beginning to recover from a hurricane. A biggest mismatch might be something like winter coats showing up in Florida or Texas in August. They're not needed and they'll just be in the way, and they probably won't be well utilized. In general, simply shipping anything to a disaster-affected area is likely to backfire unless you know somebody there. Even something obviously useful like building materials may not be used effectively unless the donation is being made to groups that are equipped to make use of them in a reasonable period of time. Sometimes the need the church is responding to is very simple. Here's a story from the Reverend Max Bailey of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Longmont, Colorado, which illustrates how they use their gifts of a large facility and a good relationship with both their neighbors and the city of Longmont.
After the floods, which significantly damaged the Southmore Park neighborhood, we were asked by city officials to use our facilities for a series of neighborhood meetings. St. Stephen's, of course, responded by setting up space to hold these meetings. Over 125 people attended each meeting, the main purpose of which was to hear residents' concerns and review the plan to rebuild. Due to these gatherings, the beloved small swimming pool that once existed across the street from St. Stephen's was put back into the planned reconstruction. And here's another story which builds on how an awareness of others' need influenced what we were able to do. We had hoped to build a labyrinth in 2013, but the flood became a more pressing issue. So 11 months after the flood, St. Stephen's constructed a labyrinth on the church property. Part of the work involved removing a portion of the lawn and replacing it with rocks and a pathway. 46 volunteers carefully removed the sod, loaded it on trucks and trailers, and transported it to the Apple Valley community in Lyons, where their yards had been completely washed away by the flood. 5 homes received a new backyard that day, and it continues to grow there today.
About 10 years ago, several youth leaders in the Episcopal Church in Colorado combined our resources and talents to plan service-oriented experiences for the youth in our churches, which also provided help to communities in need. We know that we're stronger and we can do more when we work together, and that our youth and adult leaders can be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. In early years, our group served in communities as far away as Alaska and as close to home as Leadville, Colorado. On every experience, being of true service and in right relationship with the community into which we traveled was emphasized both in our work partnerships and in the programming that was offered to our youth participants. In 2013, with Bishop Rob O'Neill's encouragement and support, our group named itself YES, for Young Episcopalians in Service. The message behind the name has to do with the way we hope to empower Colorado's youth to actively work towards loving our neighbors, particularly in times of need following disasters, but also in terms of social justice and community activism. Following the devastation of floods in northern Colorado and of Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast, in 2014, YES took a total of 111 youth and adults to communities of Estes Park, Colorado, and Staten Island, New York, to work on specific disaster recovery and rebuilding efforts. In Estes Park, one of our teams spent 4 days digging a home out of tons of silt and debris that had packed in, around, and under the house during the flood. The small structure was the only one still standing in what had been a community of about 18 houses only a year before. The owner was a young woman, not much older than our youth team, who was trying to save a homestead that had been in her family for generations. Our kids refused to leave that site until the job was done. And in the end, there were cheers and tears all around as the final shovelful of dirt came away. In the years since, YES has grown in scope and size. We've added a young adult leadership program to serve the young people who are growing up, but still adamantly want to continue serving through the YES Colorado community. We've connected youth from across the state, and every year encourage more churches to join us. We've sponsored and welcomed youth whose parishes are too small to send more than 1 or 2 kids. On every trip, our youth's eyes are open to more complex dynamics that go into the needs of a community. We've learned that sometimes need is not clearly visible. In Baton Rouge, after the floods of August 2015, we worked with a family who looked from a distance like they should have had the resources to fix their home's damage without volunteer help. We learned, however, that a combination of factors, including a young adult child with complicated disability-related needs and the lack of flood insurance because it wasn't available in their area, had left the family in a lovely middle-class home full of water damage and without the resources to do anything about it themselves. We've participated in disaster recovery in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, New York, and northern Colorado, and have served a variety of our neighbors in Alaska, Salt Lake City, Jamaica, Colorado, Albuquerque, Florida, and more. In 2018, we hope to serve right here in Denver, as well as in the ongoing recovery efforts in Houston and St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. YES strives to serve both the communities who host us and the youth of Colorado who participate in these mission experiences. We seek opportunities for youth to learn about the societal dynamics that make floods, storms, and fires most damaging to the already vulnerable in a community, and what factors inhibit their recovery. We explore and experience opportunities to serve seniors, the chronically homeless, and others who are cast out to the margins of our society. Our youth spend time reflecting on and discussing ways to act to improve everyday life for people who are marginalized. They learn and experience the power of interacting with people with dignity and respect. On a YES mission experience, youth and the adults who lead them are transformed by the power of putting our faith into action, serving Christ as we serve the least of these.
Episcopal Relief and Development works with dioceses to support congregational leaders to meet the needs that are present in their communities. It is not a deployment model. No big trucks and matching t-shirts that you may see in other denominations. We do provide coaching and resources. Response efforts are led by the needs and observations of local people rather than one-size-fits-all standardized response. Before disasters, we ask dioceses to name a contact person, and we will train and prepare that person for disaster preparedness and disaster response. After disasters, we reach out to that contact person, and we like to reach out to the bishop as well to coordinate. It's helpful if bishops will reach out to us as well, or the local people will reach out to us and let us know what's going on. Remember that a disaster is an event that overwhelms a community or a region's ability to respond locally. So often, our support is advice and support, and resources, but not financial at the same time. Some disasters are relatively small, but they're experienced locally as being big. Sometimes we do provide financial resources through the diocese to leverage its gifts to meet the needs of vulnerable neighbors, not church buildings, not church members, but the broader community. This is a global policy of Episcopal Relief and Development. These resources are usually best to expand what churches are already doing. Meal programs can get bigger. Homeless ministries can expand. After the emergency phase, we want to walk with dioceses and communities over the long term, knowing often that external support agencies leave long before the recovery is really complete. Episcopal Relief and Development Funds are dedicated to helping the most marginalized and vulnerable people to make a full and sustained recovery. Money goes to supporting outreach ministries. It does not go to pay for repairs on church buildings, programs that support only Episcopalians, or for non-disaster related programs. At this point, I'd also like to talk to you a little bit about worship after a disaster. It's important to be holding service as soon as possible in the aftermath of a disaster. Why? Because it helps support parishioners and the larger community. It's important for us to be the church, to continue to be the church, even after a disaster. Nonetheless, circumstances may make it impossible. Safety should be the top priority. Be sure to communicate information about service cancelizations as soon as possible. If you can't meet in person, there are ways to gather online or circulate prayers via email that people can feel connected to their church families even when they're separated. There are liturgical resources available at the Episcopal Relief and Development website.
The worst of the flooding in Colorado happened on Thursday the 12th and Friday the 13th in September of 2013. Longmont was severely hampered by the two rivers that cut across the city and made it very difficult to drive north or south since many of the bridges had been damaged or destroyed. Although I live only 10 minutes from church, there was no way to get across town due to the road closures. And the Southmore Park neighborhood, where the St. Stephen's is located, was closed by the National Guard unless you lived there. Emergency responders were urging people to stay off the roads. So, reluctantly, we decided that we had to cancel services for that Sunday, September 15th. The first time this had happened in anyone's memory. Email became very useful in reaching our members to let them know of the cancellation.
Having a disaster incident response center is critical. Again, have a simple plan. The canon of the ordinary should oversee the process. He or she has a duty commander in the center. Each of those parishes and missions within the disaster area should be called each morning and afternoon, checking from day to day on what they need or want. These needs are then funneled to the canon to the ordinary, and the parishes and missions that have the resources then have that opportunity to cover those needs. Having the diocesan communications director involved is key to the process. This individual writes informative articles daily and sends them out to the whole diocese and beyond, keeping all involved and all knowledgeable of what's going on. We have found that in the early days, monies, checks, and gift cards are most needed in disaster locations. Those needs change over time to respond to the unfunded needs of getting families and individuals back into their homes.